Well, I think in relation to, to the climate change issues, I'm not a scientist. I've always been a skeptic. All I will say is that everything that he said makes complete sense to me. But of course, it does segue into this question of relations between the West and Russia, because as Tom absolutely rightly said, the Russians, who never gave up on nuclear power, now have a dominant position in it. And that's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. Russia, by the way, I mean, they're very dominant in nuclear power. They've also been working very hard in other fields too, in high technology. They seem to be focusing very much in high technology areas. And if we're talking about nuclear power, they're starting apparently to miniaturize nuclear reactors, which I'm not quite sure what that means exactly and how safe that is, but it's an interesting development, and we will see what comes of that.
Well, the miniaturization, if they're talking about, and I'm sure they are, as I haven't done all the specific research on it, but I can tell you that we're not talking about Gen 1 reactors of the type of and kind of Chernobyl and Fukushima and 3 Mile Island and the rest. We're talking about these Gen 3, what were known as Gen 3, Gen 4 reactors, which, you know, they're either molten salt beds or, you know, whatever. They don't produce the waste, and they're not subject to meltdown or any of the rest of it. So they're fundamentally different technology. Yes. Miniaturizing them, you know, remember, we have the avant-garde missile program where they want to put nuclear, you know, power. The Russians want to put nuclear power plants on missiles and send them around so they can like circle the Earth for, you know, almost indefinitely. I'm more worried about them than doing that and sticking a laser on it and shooting communication satellites down, because I do believe that once they miniaturize them enough that they can actually do both of those things, because they have the power. They have lasers more powerful enough to do that already, mounted on ships. For taking out drones and the rest of it. So, I mean, from a military perspective, there's all sorts of crazy stuff we're going to be moving into in that perspective going forward. And the colonization of space is a completely different discussion. I did a podcast with Patrick Henningsen, 21st Century Wire recently. We discussed Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and their ambitions in space and what that may or may not mean. From the power dynamic between the U.S., Russia, and the EU, I think a lot of people have it wrong. And I think we've, you know, there are a lot of incredibly gifted and talented people operating in our space of alternative political analysis, right? From, you know, the Saker to Pepe Escobar to even Caitlin Johnstone, who I have a real fundamental problem with. They are all vaguely leftist in their thinking, some more than others. And I think that, you know, like I just read Pepe's latest article about the sovereignty of Germany, which was very good. But I've kind of moved beyond that position because I think he's missing a fundamental point, because Pepe makes no bones about, you know, not about disagreeing with the U.S.'s hegemonic activities, right? And you'll get no argument from me about that either. I agree with him on that. But sometimes I've noticed, especially in the last year or so, that those folk on that side of the political fence doing that analysis, I don't care if it's George Galloway or if it's Scott Ritter, or it doesn't matter who it is, I see the same thing over and over again, which is there's a kind of blind spot towards China, as well as overly attacking the U.S., being blinded by their hatred of the U.S. and missing what's happening in Europe. Because I don't see Biden as anything other than an Obama restoration. Obama, when he was in the White House, his foreign policy was absolutely as pro-European as possible. The Iran nuclear deal was done for the Europeans to allow them to invest in Iran for energy security, which Trump spent 4 years undoing. And to me, I look at everything that's happening in service of the Great Reset and everything that Klaus Schwab and the Davos crowd are arguing for. That's all benefiting Germany. And Germany has always been, since World War II, an occupied country. We, the United States, occupied Germany with 50,000 troops, right? And Merkel has always played this idea that she's the victim of this. And she's used that with Putin for years to excuse her worst behavior, fomenting a coup in Ukraine, the sanctions because of Crimea, barely allowing Nord Stream 2 to get through, but then putting unbelievable pressure on Gazprom in every other area. It was Merkel who stopped South Stream. because she didn't want Southern Europe to get the power. She wanted that power routed through Germany with Nord Stream. Okay, it's always been about consolidating political and economic power in Germany to take over the EU, to solidify that over the EU, and then when the time was right, subordinate the EU and undermine the United States to the point where where our military could be used by the Germans to throw them at the Russians and the Chinese. That's what I think the real plan is, and you can see that very carefully now. You can see that very obviously in the way Putin and his foreign minister Sergei Lavrov are telling Merkel to go, basically to go take a flying leap. What tore it for them was last year when they knew that they had the election ring fence for Biden, and they pulled the Navalny thing, and they tried to pull off the coup in Belarus at the same time. And I think that Merkel has, as you said the other day in one of your videos, Alexander, Merkel radically overplayed her hand on this. And it pissed Putin off to the point where he no longer wants to deal with her anymore. Nord Stream 2 will be the last project they do together.
Yes.
And we are now looking at a power dynamic where Germany thinks they have control over the United States political process and its military, and they're very obviously telling the Russians, this is what we're going to do through NATO, and the Russians are going, Mon Ave, bring it on. Come on, bring it on.
Yes.
Because you're not going to win. And every time Merkel tries to play that game with Putin, Putin just looks at her and goes, no, you can't have, I'm not changing the terms of the Ukraine gas contract. No, you can have Nord Stream 2. No, you can't have this. No, you can't have that. And by the way, if you want to maintain political power, you got to take our vaccine now as well. Because our vaccine works as opposed to Pfizer's. Yeah. Very important point.
Their vaccine is actually a vaccine versus...
Right, it's actually a vaccine and not something to wipe out generations. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, can I just say, I read Pepe Escobar's article, and I also have some issues with it, and it flows a lot from what you say about Pepe and people. A lot of these people being very, very antagonistic to the US, and Pepe's mistake. And I've actually, because I know Pepe, by the way, I
have a lot of respect for the man. I hate to call him
great respect for him. But where I think he makes a mistake is that I think he sees the world as a great geopolitical chess game. A great geopolitical chess game between the US on the one hand and the Chinese on the Russians on the other. And every move that he sees is a move on this great chess board that is happening, and that Germany is somehow, the sort of a big piece on this board, and if the Russians and the Chinese capture this piece, this will somehow weaken the US. And he thinks very much in these terms. That is a very Western, very American, dare I say, very left-wing way of looking at the world. Yes. It's not at all the way the Chinese or the Russians think. I mean, it's not. They are not playing this chess game. It reminds me very much, by the way, of a book that I read long ago about the so-called Great Game that the British were playing with the Russians in Central Asia. And what we now discovered is, yes, the British thought that they were playing this great game with the Russians in Central Asia in the 19th century. The Russians weren't even aware there was a game. They were doing various things there. I mean, this is entirely a conception which the British had, because the British think in this geopolitical way. The Russians and the Chinese fundamentally don't. Russians and Chinese at this moment are focused on one thing overwhelmingly, which is building up their own societies, especially the Russians. From their point of view, they are well aware that there are lots of problems within Russia. Chinese to some extent also. And they are overwhelmingly focused on sorting out those. They understand, and this is where the Russians have come to this understanding very belatedly. The Chinese understood this long ago. But the Russians had thought to themselves, well, at one time, the way we're going to develop our societies is by integrating ourselves with the West, joining the European Union. There were people in Russia in the 90s who talked in this way. We want to be part of this greater Western world. That's where the success is. They came to understand that if they did that, if they sacrificed their independence in that kind of way, they would sacrifice they would throw away their future and their own prospects at their own development. The Russian objective at this precise moment in time is sovereignty, independence, because that is the route towards development. It's not about playing grand geopolitical chess. in order to sort of knock out the United States. That isn't how the Russians think. I don't think it's how the Chinese think either. And in terms of this issue of Greater Eurasia, which is what Pepe Escobar was really very focused on, I actually had the advantage of being in a room, physically in a room, when Putin actually spoke about this. It was at the SPIEF conference in St. Petersburg in 2016. And it was absolutely clear to me that for Putin and for the Russians, Greater Eurasia, which was, establishing economic links and bridges, was not about some kind of grand geopolitical play. It was about developing commercial relations with Europe and with China and saying, look, we're all going to benefit mutually. We're all able to trade with each other. Let's work together. Let's build a road and rail links, and let's be better off, and let's reduce tensions and ease problems around the world. It was not intended in the way that Pepe thinks, as trying to pull the Germans away from the US.
Right.
I don't think that's
think that way.
all about it. Yeah,
I used to think that way. And in 2014, 2015, I used to think that way. I don't think that way any longer.
Yeah.
And when you touched on that idea is a very Western thing. It's like a hallmark of American foreign policy training. It's still doctrine over at military doctrine over at West Point, right? It's still the way it's still the way the State Department operates. It's still the way the CIA operates. It's still the way the British intelligence operates. So he's not wrong in viewing the world that way, because the one side of the major players in this chess game.
Yes.
But to look at the geopolitical map today and say it's chess is the wrong metaphor. It's
Absolutely.
Not chess and it's not Go. Those are two-player games. You have to get into multivariable, multifactional 3 to 6 player board games, which is what I do. And I've been training myself as a political analyst by playing these freaking games for the last 30 years.
Yes.
And I'm not going to go into, the games themselves. I talked about this on my live stream, but I see this stuff as, if you make that move, you're unbalancing the board for that guy. Now that guy's going to win and he's going to take this. And you're like, so how do you balance 5 people? You schmooze that guy, you hold him off, and you play the 5-sided game that you're actually playing. Sit down. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, sit down with your friends and play the classic game diplomacy. You will not have your friends anymore, because by the time you're done playing diplomacy, you all hate each other.
Exactly.
Because that's why I don't play diplomacy anymore. But you will understand exactly what I'm talking about. And I think that kind of two-dimensional thinking, kind of almost goes back to Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. He betrays two-dimensional thinking, Spock says, not as opposed to with submarine warfare, not ships on the water warfare, right? It's the same kind of thing. I think it's a real failing. And I think I don't know, and I was talking with Patrick Henningsen about this privately on Twitter for like a week. We were DMing back and forth. He said, have you noticed that we have the biggest humanitarian crisis in the history, and political and humanitarian crisis in the history of the world, these lockdowns, and all of these commentators are refusing to talk about it. Why? Because it potentially throws shade on China, and it potentially throws shade on the left, and they won't accept it. And so they just ignore it. I'm like, you're absolutely right. And then that's when, then we started like throwing personal insults back and forth. But, was that?
Play out? How is this going to play out? And how is it going to play out on the terrain of Europe, but also in the terrain of the Middle East?
Right. Let me take this one to start out with. I think it's going to be a mess. Okay. I think it's going to go down the worst way imaginable, because the people who are in charge of this process and who have all this power are going to utilize that power in the most indiscriminate way imaginable. The more they fail, the more desperate they will become. Right? The more you have power and the more you are desperate to maintain power, the more desperate your actions will be. And, think the Battle of the Bulge, right? And from a military perspective, it's like the best example I can come up with. And there's a great scene in Patton. The German army hasn't mounted a winter assault since Frederick the Great. Well, that's why I think that's exactly what they're going to do, because they're desperate, right? The same thing will happen here. The lockdowns will start to fail. The protests will continue to gather strength. Putin and company will continue to make geopolitical moves that just stonewall them. The Chinese will do the same thing. They'll, all of these things will happen, and they will get more and more desperate. That's why I said earlier, I'm worried about war. How can they gin up a war conflict? Now, a couple of things that I've noticed recently, Alexander, you can chime in and make sure that I've got my facts correct here, but apparently You know, Israel and Syria were talking recently, prisoner swap. I saw a thing about there's a prisoner swap happening between Israel and Syria that the Russians just negotiated, mediated. And that is maybe the beginnings of a thaw, because between Israel and Syria, we've also got the latest Astana talks going on, right? Astana format talks going on in Syria at the same time as Biden is trying to, you know, ramp up support for the Kurds in eastern Syria to try and, you know, reestablish the Obama era policy. I don't know. There's a lot going on here. I'm starting to see stuff coming out of the Israeli political system that says to me that Netanyahu and the Likud party are really beginning to fracture for real.
Yes,
and if that's the case, then the only good thing that can come out of the Biden administration is a lack of direct U.S. support for Israel, which will force them to the negotiating table.
Yeah, if we could just get to that. Can I just finish a few points about the Russian-European relationship? Because what has happened is that, of course, in 2016, I think, was the last time that I heard Putin talk about Greater Eurasia in that way. What has now happened is that the Russians have come to the realization it's not going to happen.
Right.
They've accepted, they've realized that the Europeans are never going to do these things, even if it's in their own interests to do them, because this isn't really what Europe is all about. And the Russians have also come to another realization. They don't need it to happen. That Russia doesn't actually need Greater Eurasia in order to make itself economically successful. And in fact, they have all the means and all the resources, all the abilities to do it. Now the trading relationship with China. And so this has fundamentally changed Russian perceptions about the importance of their relationship with Europe. So an imbecile like Joseph Borrell can come along to Moscow and give them lectures, and they will simply show him the door, as they would do to Merkel as well. And they say to Merkel, well, look, we're going to finish Nord Stream 2 because that's our agreement. But if you want to stop it, it's up to you. If you don't want any more, if you want more pipelines, well, no thanks. We've already got into all kinds of problems with you with the existing pipelines. We're not going to waste more time getting into having more arguments and more quarrels about things like that. So in effect, that whole period of policy that existed in Russia, where Russia was seeing itself as trying to engage with the West and saying to itself, we somehow need this contact with the West in order to develop our economy and our society, that is ending. And I don't think people understand this. I don't think people in Europe, I think people in Europe are beginning to sense it, and it's starting to alarm and shock them.
Yes.
But that this is a major sea change in international relations, because to be very clear about this, the Soviet Union was also very, very interested in developing a relationship with Europe. Russia, ever since Peter the Great's time, has been obsessed with its relationship with Europe. Suddenly, you get the sense that the Russians aren't interested in it anymore. And of course, the Russians now see Europe for what it is. They see the West for what it is. And they're no longer in awe of it as they once were, because they see how dysfunctional and incompetent it has become. Exactly. So this is a fundamental relations.
And everything, and to further that point, if anybody thinks that Russia's still just a gas station that we drive by, ready with nuclear weapons, ready, they now fully source their own mid-level commercial airliner to challenge the Airbus A320 and the Boeing 737, all Russian sourced. That has immense supply chain effect all the way down the line to produce the avionics, to produce the seats and the fuselage and the jet engines and the this and everything that goes into a modern airplane.
Yes.
Okay. Massive thing that they can now do. And they can, of course, because the West has done the dumb thing of sanctioning the crap out of the Russians, the Russian ruble is trading at 30% under the value that it should be trading at if it was properly traded versus the dollar and the euro.
Yeah.
The Russian ruble trades at 73 to the dollar and 95 to the euro. Like they're going to be able to sell these planes for half the price that Airbus and Boeing are. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Because of the currency effect. Now, you think that wasn't a big coming out party? What about the vaccine itself?
Yeah.
Now, Sputnik 5 is the vaccine that's going to end the political torture inflicted on the world by COVID-19. And from the moment the Russians announced Sputnik 5, and I read up on how it was designed and how quickly it was able to be spun up and how it's just a variation on the exact vaccines that they created for SARS, MERS, and Ebola, I said, this is a geopolitical weapon to counter the lockdown policy in the West. That's what this is for. This is the greatest piece of the puzzle to undermine and attack Klaus Schwab and their policy, because when the other vaccines fail, Sputnik 5 can be produced for almost nothing. The Russians were licensing it to everybody to produce it royalty-free and to give it to the world as a grand gesture of peace to get everything back to normal. And look who has embraced it. India, South America, China. You know, Chinese are making their own variation on the same type of adenovirus vector vaccine. But what you're seeing is everybody outside of US and Europe, where they were doing this for as subsidy to big pharma, are embracing it so that they can get back to normal. So that if Europe does go through with their, well, we're going to put in vaccine passports or medical passports in order for you to travel to Europe, and they're going to try to export that bad idea to the world, well, you can go get the Sputnik 5 shot, which may or may not help you, and it doesn't really matter because you now pass. And for 50 cents, you have your papers, and it's on your phone, and you're done, and that's it. It's out the door. And that is a massive undermining of the entire political agenda of control, because the goal of the Great Reset is to shrink the division of labor, is to shrink the complexity of the economy, right? Because they can't control a complex economy, a hyper-financialized economy like we have today. They can't do it. They don't know how to do it. So they want central bank digital currencies to control what you're allowed to spend everything on and control the complexity of the economy by telling you you're only allowed to have these jobs. Because in their small minds, that's all they can control. And in their arrogant minds, that's all we should aspire to.
Yeah.
And let the robots deal with everything else, which is just complete insanity.
It is complete insanity.
It's complete insanity, but it is what it is, and we have to deal with these people until they're off the stage.
And just to finish on this, and of course, because this points to where the real challenge that Russia and China represent, which is not that they are playing geopolitical chess, because they're not. It is because they are developing their own societies.
Yes.
They're able to produce things like Sputnik 5. They're able to do all of these things, and they're able to do it more successfully. It is that ultimately which is going to make the difference. Just as the United States in the 19th century wasn't really involved in international relations and in geopolitics in the way that the European powers in those days were. And the result was it became the mightiest economy in the world, and it swept the board. And when it
geography had a lot to do with that as well.
Geography had a huge role.
Not have an industrial base bomb back to the Stone Age, kind of a small point, but yes.
All completely true. But you get my underlying point. The United States was not involved. It did not go around the world seeking monsters to slay in the way, words of John Quincy Adams. It didn't set out until the very end of the 19th century to create a far-flung colonial empire. It was not involved in the struggles, the conflicts in Europe. And the result was it built itself up. And in a way, that's what the Russians and the Chinese are doing. They may not be saying to themselves, well, in 10 years' time, we're going to be, well, maybe the Chinese are to some extent, but they're not perhaps going to the extent of saying, well, we're going to be, the masters of the universe if we keep on this. It's
going to happen by default.
But it's going to happen by default, because that is exactly how these things are going to play out. They go, and again, the lesson of Sputnik V, which was what the Americans used to do, is that the Russians just got together and they developed a vaccine. They did it simply and quickly, and they did it well, which is what America used to do. Because America isn't able to do that anymore. No. Because we have all these enormously complex governmental decision-making processes that now happen in the West, and we have all these enormously powerful pharmaceutical companies which are integrated with the political system. We don't have a simple, a bunch of scientists in a laboratory sitting together and working it out. It doesn't happen like that in the West anymore. But
Well,
in
we still have
Russia,
that in technology. We still have
we
that
still
in
have
the
the technology. It's not the technology.
No.
It's the bureaucracy.
No, I know. I agree completely.
It's the structure.
I would say it's the purpose
What's interesting is that we're but you're
Hold on a second, Tom.
right into we're going to so
it's the purpose.
I can
and
see
the
where this is
intention.
going.
It's the purpose and the intention. So I can get how the Sputnik 5 has been created in order to provide immunity and protection from COVID. But
Yes.
the mRNA vaccines, they don't have that intention. They
No.
have the intention of enriching the big pharma and also as a means of control, social control.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
So what's interesting about that? So you spoke that the thing about Sputnik 5 is that it's a piece of innovation, right? One of the things that I've come recently to really start to integrate into my head, and we just published and my partner and I just explored all of this in the last issue of my newsletter. And the only reason I'm bringing that up is because that's where it was published. These ideas were just published, and we literally put them out on Thursday, which is that. One of the things that's happening, and it's not like it's a profound point, but when you hear it, you're like, oh, exactly. Which is that the bureaucracy has become so big. This is Act 3 of Atlas Shrugged. This is Ayn Rand is somewhere smiling from her grave, right, over what's happening, watching all of this bureaucracy destroy the innovation and the dynamism. We talk about the lack of innovation and dynamism in Europe, how Merkel has been an agent of a stasis in Europe. Alex and Alex make this point on the Duran all the time, and it's beautiful. So now let's take it one step further. What's the real goal of the Great Reset? Which is, of course, to get control of the global monetary system in such a way that they can restrict choice, right? And by restricting choice, you can restrict what the range of reactions that people can have to whatever the edicts are that come down from the oligarchs that run everything, yada, yada, yada. That's what they want. They want top-down total control. Now, the problem with this is the bureaucracy is running slower than the pace of innovation. Right? We saw this in the rise of the internet back in 1995. Right? The internet, the old economy, kept saying over and over and over again. You saw it on CNBC. You saw it no matter where you went. This internet thing is cool, but it won't replace the real economy because everybody still does. This is the way things have been done. This is the way things will always be done. And of course, technologists are saying, but technology always obviates old technology. New technology always obviates old technology. So now I'm going to morph into Bitcoin because the linchpin to the Great Reset is central bank digital currencies. You can't pull any of what they're trying to pull off and then continue to enforce all of these social control mechanisms that they've been assiduously putting in place and getting us more and more used to the boiled frog syndrome, right? How can you tell an American in an airport? He takes off his shoes whenever he approaches security, right? Right? So when you really start thinking about this, the bureaucracy has become so huge and so bloated, it can't respond in real time to the same level of innovation that's happening in the crypto space in terms of money. We have new technology for money. Bitcoin itself is alpha code that went viral. I'm not here talking about Bitcoin specifically, BTC. I'm talking about Bitcoin as metaphor or where we're headed. We have our choice in front of us, economic actors, of how we transmit information and value in an information-based society. All this fourth industrial revolution nonsense that Klaus Schwab talks about. We have a choice in front of us. We can have custodial money that invokes property rights of individuals, or we can have non-custodial money that empowers oligarchs. Well, everybody's chosen that they don't want that, because if they did want that, Bitcoin wouldn't be $57,000 a coin today. It would have never gone past $5. Okay, I was first introduced to Bitcoin at the start when it was trading for. It didn't trade. Okay. When they couldn't get a Wikipedia page, for Christ's sake. That's how early into this I was, and I didn't see it for what it was at the time. Because I wasn't convinced that anybody else would see what I saw. I was so early that I didn't. That's where we are today. And Elon Musk last week told everybody that the world just changed.
Yeah,
that it's okay now, and because of that, I am convinced the Great Reset is going to fail, but it's going to fail in the worst way imaginable. It's going to cause the worst amount of effect because these people are still running their script. Christine Lagarde is still going to cancel cash in Europe. George Soros is still going to get his consols and the perpetual debt to wipe out the European debt and force and destroy Italy and destroy Greece and destroy Portugal and destroy Spain. They're going to do this. and everybody, and they're going to destroy, and they're trying to destroy the United States. And I go back and I bring up Ron DeSantis here in Florida. Is Ron DeSantis going to go along with this? Or is Ron DeSantis going to deny President Biden the National Guard one day and force Joe Biden's hand? Okay? Because that mechanistically is what starts the quote unquote Second American Civil War. Okay? These are the outcomes of these that I see in the future. And I think the Russians see all this as well, which is why they're pulling back from all this insanity and going, look, we're not dealing with you.
No.
Well, we're happy to deal with you if you deal with us as partners. But the minute you start like playing your typical game where you're going to we're going to push our military out there to enforce the dollar hegemony, the dollar, we're going to be like, no, sorry. They're like, no, sorry. Poland, you can have a pipeline if you want. We can make Nord Stream 3 and it goes like right to Kaliningrad and then into Poland and Latvia. If you want one, we'll build it for you. If not, yeah, that's nice too. Because there's one to build in Kazakhstan, or wherever. So go to Mongolia. So
Alexander?
No, this is absolutely correct. And this is I think, now, as I said, I'm not an expert on Bitcoin and digital.
You're fast becoming one, I hope, right?
I'm beginning to become one. And I am beginning to understand it better. And of course, what is driving it? First of all, obviously, there's the technology. But secondly, there's the need. Because people are becoming conscious that there is this great demand on, from the power, if you like, to control our lives and to control our lives in all kinds of ways. And at the same time, there's a concern about the debasement of currencies, which is definitely happening because of the way in which currencies are worked. So there is therefore a need for something like Bitcoin. And where there is a need, it appears. And of course, the technology which these people have been looking at, the powers, if you like, have been looking at to use in order to control our lives, actually undermines them, because it makes possible the very mechanisms for resistance to them that they resent, that makes their entire project in the end impossible. They can't really defeat human resources and resilience, but also their technologies ultimately work against them, even as they try to use them. And of course, this creates extraordinary tensions. And can I just make a comment here? I want to just finish with Russia, just on this particular, because Biden made a remarkable speech. Well, it wasn't remarkable; it was actually an incredibly boring speech. But that's another. He made a speech to the Munich Security Conference. It was, of course, virtual, and it was, of course, not by him anyway. It was written for him by other people, and he fluffed his lines in various places. And bizarrely, the White House transcript shows where he fluffs his lines, which is interesting in itself. But anyway, it contains this one, I thought, utterly fascinating paragraph, which it says is this. We are going to be able to meet the threat from Russia. The Kremlin attacks our democracies and weaponizes corruption to try to undermine our system of government. Russian leaders want people to think that our system is more corrupt or as corrupt as theirs. But the world knows that isn't true, including Russians' own citizens. What Biden is saying...
Well, hold on, Alexander. What Biden is saying, what planet is Biden on?
Well, wait. But think this through, because obviously it's absurd at many levels. But think this through. What he is saying is, if you, Rich, if you, Tom, say West is corrupt, was more corrupt than Russia, you are repeating Russian disinformation.
Yep.
And therefore, that justifies action being taken against you. So if you start talking about corruption in the West, you are the Kremlin's tool.
Mm-hmm.
That is actually incredibly sinister. But again, the fact that this is happening shows that people like the people who've written Biden's speech, which is probably not Biden, definitely not Biden, are concerned that people in the West are starting to worry about inequality, about corruption, about all of these things. And that shows you the actual role that Russia actually has at the moment in the West. It's, of course, an adversary at many levels, but principally, it's a scarecrow. It's a thing that you conjure up so that if people start talking about topics like corruption, in fact, specifically corruption, You say, well, it's not because we're corrupt, it's because the Russians are saying we're corrupt. And if you say we're corrupt, you're actually working for them. And that way we can bring down the hammer on you. By contrast, in fact, he goes on to say, and he talks about Russia, that it's not about pitting, I'm getting quoting again, it's not about pitting East against West. It's not about we want a conflict. We cannot and must not return to the reflexive opposition and rigid blocks of the Cold War. So he's also saying to the Russians, well, actually, we're not looking for a fight with you. Actually, he says other things about that, which might make you think that he actually is looking for a fight with them. But it's not ultimately about Russia itself. He's using Russia as a means of control within Western societies, as a justification for steps taken within Western societies to limit discussion, to limit discourse here. And it's the same with the efforts they're going to make increasingly, I predict, to try to take action against the emergence of things like Bitcoin. You're going to find all kinds of stories being spread about Bitcoin, about how it's used in all sorts of sinister ways, because they sense that their technologies that they've been looking at and using and wanting to use to expand their control are actually working against them.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right, and it's very true. I just saw there was an article in the New York Times yesterday saying, "Do you want to go down that rabbit hole?" or something like that. That was it was absolutely designed from the ground up to say, if you, and so it's being marketed, who's being marketed to, if you start searching out new information, if you do any kind of critical thinking, then you need to stop doing that and just stay in the bubble. That shows me how scared they are. The fact that we have permanent now, barriers around the White House and Congress in Washington, D.C. We've got 25,000 troops being garrisoned there for no discernible reason.
Yes.
These people are scared. They know where they are. They know how tenuous their hold on power is, because they know that they've lost the legitimacy, and now they can only rule through might. And what they'll do next is to silence all this. They'll silence as many alternative voices as possible. Now,
Tom, sorry, and that ties in with the whole discourse about that characterizes Trump's supporters as domestic terrorists.
Absolutely,
absolutely.
No, with the global war on terror is over. It is now a fight, a war of all against all of the state versus domestic terrorists. That's what we have here in the United States now. And it's
not just in the US. The governments are becoming the enemies of the people.
Yeah, well, that's very normal during a late stage societal collapse like this. And so, what I've been saying to people for a long time now is that, look, and I've been saying to my subscribers, and I've been saying to my patrons, and even to people on YouTube, is like, look, when I bought gold started buying gold and silver back in 2002, because I could see the next financial crisis on the horizon, I never thought about it in terms of, well, I'd sell it maybe in 2003 or 2004. I looked at it as, I'm going to sell it when the monetary system fundamentally changes. That means I may have to hold on to it for a generation or two. I was buying gold in my 30s when my daughter was born, and I was always thinking of it in terms of, I may have to hold on to this to will it to her. Well, I've told people the same thing about Bitcoin or cryptos in general. Again, expanding the discussion beyond just Bitcoin, which I think is alpha code that went viral. And also an expression of just how badly people wanted something real. They were willing to put their faith in this literal alpha code of, with a hodgepodge of ancient technology, right? Elon Musk even said that the other day. He's like, Bitcoin, I didn't say Bitcoin wasn't dumb. It's just less dumb than what we currently have, right? He tweeted that out like yesterday or the day before, after validating it for the entire world. And now BlackRock is dipping their toe into Bitcoin. If BlackRock is dipping their toe into Bitcoin, that's the signal that the financial system has failed to contain it. It's now jump containment. And now we know what the real war is. I'm saying the same thing to people now, which is that you may be looking at holding on to this stuff for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. You may be only looking at crypto projects that have roadmaps that are 4, 5, 6, 7 years long. Okay. You have to start thinking in these terms, because the monetary dislocation that's going to happen and the amount of aggression you're going to have to deal with from failing governments to try and steal your wealth away from you is going to be unlike anything we've ever seen in the past. We saw it in Germany in the 1920s. We saw it Alexander brought it up in 1917. We saw it here in the United States in 1933 through 1938. Like, this is not new. This is what always happens when societies fail, and a great shift occurs in the way I put it in an article the other day and through my newsletter. It is the great shifts of capital flight from one side of the world to the other, which we record as history. History of capital flight is a human history. If you separate, you can't separate the economics of where people put their money from the events of history. Okay? Because capital usually moves ahead of political events. This is why Martin Armstrong's arguments are very, very powerful. He is right about that. And, which is that capital flows will start to show you the signs early. And we're in the early stages of another big shift. And at the same time, we're also dealing with massive change in technology and the speed at which technology and innovation can outpace the bureaucracy's attempt to rein it in. And as that shift occurs, and as that accelerates, as one technology, as innovation far outstrips the bureaucracy, all the bureaucracy has is a bigger hammer, and they're going to use that bigger hammer in the most indiscriminate way.
Yes.
Okay, and then you just have to be. And an example of that is India coming out and saying, "We're banning Bitcoin. You need to liquidate your accounts in 6 months." I'm like, good luck with that, Modi. No keys, no custody.
But also, I think Nigeria banned it. I saw a headline.
Was it? I thought the Nigerian parliament was talking about legitimizing it and making it the national currency.
Well, I saw this article because it was saying that in Nigeria, it was like selling for $76,000.
Well, sure.
Because of the premium, because the government banning it. And then I've been talking to a couple of Indian contacts I have, and they're saying, what's likely to happen? Are people going to gravitate towards privacy cryptos?
Yeah, well, exactly. And you and I have made this point together for years. I've always said that privacy and governance are the two things that we need to be looking at as the things that matter in crypto projects going forward. If you want to know where the money is really going to be made in crypto going forward, privacy and governance. Those are the two things that Bitcoin doesn't provide, and those are the things that Bitcoin and that's only part of what is Bitcoin's Achilles heel in the long run. In the short run, Bitcoin is winning.
Yep.
In the long run, something else may win, or something else may rise up next to it to complement and accentuate it. And by the way, gold is not done either by any stretch of the imagination. No. So it's not out of this equation at all. It's just right now we haven't had the collapse in confidence accelerate fast enough for gold to truly express itself. It's still being run by the financial guys who relate it to rising real rates, to the rise and fall of real interest rates in the US dollar. And because of that is still governing the gold trade. When that trade starts to break down, that's when gold is going to soar. So if you want so for those of you in the audience who are wondering when gold is going to break out, watch the relationship between real rates and gold. Zero Hedge will have an article on it the minute there's a spike, I'm sure. So
thank you, Tom. Alexander.
No, I mean, absolutely. I completely, but the fundamental point is, and this is something I do believe, that the technology has escaped the control of those who've been trying to control it. They can't control it anymore. And it's not just, of course, the internet, it's all the things that go into the internet. People have abilities now at all levels of human society to exercise their own power and their own control. They could set up their own currencies. They could create their own information and data networks. That's never happened before. And of course, you can try and do what Mr. Modi did in India. You can try and suppress this. And sooner or later, we're going to see the same thing happen in the West. We're going to see this happening in the United States and in Europe. And what that will do is it will accelerate the inevitable collapse of the system of control that you see. That is what invariably happens when samizdat started to appear in the Soviet Union in the 1960s. It very quickly slipped out of the control of the Kremlin, of the Soviet leadership. They might try, as they did, to restrict the spread of photocopiers, which they did do, but it wasn't in the end successful. They couldn't in the end control it, and more people were reading it and forming their own views, and ultimately a civil society evolved, which is outside their control. The same thing is happening in the West today. We quoted this line from, I think, Star Wars about, the more you tighten your fist, the more star systems can slip through your fingers. Exactly, and I'm convinced we are in that situation now. So you could start deplatforming people. You could throw a Parler off its platforms, and it comes back maybe not quite in the same shape that it was. And if Parler isn't going to work, something else will be created in its place. And yes, you can put all sorts of obstacles in the way of doing that, but eventually people will find their way.
I always say to people I call them monetary Luddites, because they truly are, and most of them are gold bugs, and they're either Peter Schiff or Nouriel Roubini or whoever. Doesn't matter. And I call these people out publicly all the time. So I'm well beyond caring about whether or not I'm being couth or not, because I'm just kind of not. So the monetary Luddites refuse to accept the fact that technology has moved on, and the same thing will happen in the social media space. I've been a fan of, and I've seen this censorship thing coming for a long time, and we're going to have blockchain-based social media.
Lbry
that will be uncanceled, but we already have it in video technology. We had it in Steam. Has had it. Steam. It's been there for years. It was just badly rolled out and badly designed. Yes. A new version of it will be, either Steam will resurrect itself now that it's on Tron, or it will, or something else will start will rise to take its place. It doesn't matter. Once you can't cancel somebody's voice, because that's what the blockchain is all about. The blockchain is about creating the apparent, the consensus for permanence. We want this event to be marked in time as inviolate. That's what crypto says. And it says we choose this to stay in place, not you. So it's not on a centralized server that Google can turn off or Amazon can turn off. It's a distributed network into all these people who keep saying, well, the governments will just shut it down. I'm like, really? Have you studied how TCP/IP works? Because if you did, then Napster wouldn't still exist. The Pirate Bay still wouldn't exist. BitTorrent wouldn't exist, because these people are desperate to put their toll booths in front of all of that stuff, and they haven't been able to do it for a generation, and they never will. All they can do is raise the cost of, or lower, and what it's done is it's lowered the cost of our being willing to be legal. That's why Disney Plus is $7 a month, not $20. Because people won't pay $20 a month for Disney Plus. They'll go to friggin' the Pirate Bay and go get everything and watch it for free.
Yes. Okay.
So Disney Plus at $8 is down to cost. Same thing with HBO Max and all the rest of them. So it's very, very obvious how intellectual property is changing, how control over information is changing, and how all of it's changing. And once this stuff's on the blockchain, and I'm not saying that the blockchain cures everything, because it doesn't. But because encrypted databases do some things just better. Okay. What's important is that we have the option of doing so. And we have I make this point over and over and over again, and I continue to make it until I finally get it through the gold bugs' heads. This is the first moment in history where we as people have the opportunity to utilize a currency in which no human beings were involved in the creation of those units. Yep. Period. Oh, and there's the best part of the day, Alexander's dog vision. Oh my God. Just speak so we can see. Speak, Alexander, so we can see him.
Hello, yes,
look how beautiful he is. Holy, beautiful. Yeah. I can't get Cow on my camera. So my cat. Yeah. So it's so very important, because ultimately all of this stuff is about rebuilding those human bonds in such a way that they're trying to destroy, in such a way that they can't take away from us again. Because, and that's what's going to drive this adoption. And it doesn't matter whether you're right today that in 20 years gold is going to beat crypto. Who cares? You wasted 20 years. And the time value of money is all that matters. And poor people are poor because they don't understand the time value of money, and they'd rather be right than rich. They'd rather be right than, and people like this would rather be right than right now. Right now. It's dumb and it's silly, but it is what it is, and people are ideologically motivated and it's no different than the woke patrol. There's no different than the ideological blinders of the woke patrol, and I can't. You can't get through to them. I can't. I've been trying for months.
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, the great attraction for gold is to people like me, if I can put it like that, who belong to because we can understand gold. We're not technologically minded people. So gold is something that we can touch, we can see, we know what it is. We remember a world before 1971 where it was, the linchpin of the financial system. We used to watch, Goldfinger, trying to steal the gold bars from Fort Knox, and for us that was an important thing because if he'd succeeded, that would have undermined the financial system. So it's a backward-looking thing. And of course, the point about Bitcoin and all these things is that they are forward-looking. They are for a world that perhaps people like me have some more difficulty understanding. And when we listen to the Rubinis and the Peter Schiffs, it's reassuring because it takes us back to something that we remember. But there's that Greek philosopher who said you can never go back into the same river twice.
Yes,
because the water has moved on. And I have to say, I think gold does have a role to play, but I don't see it as the future of the world financial system. I think this is an impossible thing for it to happen now because things have moved on so far and so fast, and we have different, a completely different set of people now accustomed and comfortable with technologies, comfortable with the ideas of things like Bitcoin. And that, in my opinion, is going to continue and move further on. I just wanted to add one other thing, which is, of course, that if governments try to get in the way of this, which, of course, certainly in the West they will, they won't succeed in the end, but they will succeed for a short time in slowing down the pace of technological and innovation and social development. So they will intensify those elements of ossification and stagnation and loss of dynamism in the West, which we already see.
Yeah,
that's what happened again.
Thinking about their own demise.
Exactly.
And we'll force and remember that capital flows to where it's treated best.
Exactly.
And so where's capital going to flow? Well, the institutional money will flow to China. And that's just what's going to happen. Yeah. And look, I don't have a crystal ball as to whether or not Bitcoin and crypto are going to win, but they're winning, even if all they're doing now is forcing the acceleration of the end of the old system. I don't think it's look, I know how the plumbing of the financial system works. I know how these people screw with various markets and manipulate the price of gold and the price of silver and all the rest of it. I get all that stuff. I understand gamma squeezes. I understand how they push the futures market and how they use this stuff. They use the stock of gold that exists against the very people who are trying to diversify into gold. But that's not to say that gold isn't important. Gold may still wind up being important one day if all the stuff I talked about relative to the sun becomes important again. Yeah. And, the electrical grid is knocked out for a great portion of the world for a period of time. It's possible. It's not a non-zero probability at this point. It's 20 to 30, unfortunately. We may all live long to see. I hope prepare for it, but I hope not. And at the same time, even if we're wrong about Bitcoin in the short run or in the long run, in the short run, bullion dealers take gold or take Bitcoin. Like you can buy gold with appreciating Bitcoin and accumulate more gold if that's what you want. But don't be stupid and change and be wedded to your thesis, because the one thing I was talking to Dave Cullum the other day, and he said, but the Bitcoin advocates bother me because they don't see any risks. And he's like, all of my best ideas scared the hell out of me. It's a great quote. Like, it is a great quote. I'm like, and I'm trying to get him on my podcast so I can actually talk to him and expand on that, because I agree with him. This scares the bejesus out of me. That I'm like putting my reputation and my life and everything else on the line on this, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, like I said, I have to be flexible and go, look, I may be right and I may be wrong. There's no reason to choose one versus the other, because both are sovereignty. And to top all this off, put a cap on this, what do you think of Elon Musk asking the Kremlin for an audience?
Well, indeed. I mean, that's an extraordinary event. And
of course it is.
The Russians, by the way, are intrigued by it. I mean, they're not saying, well, who is this idiot? Let's not have anything to do with him. On the contrary, they're saying, well, if he wants to talk to us, we are, very willing to listen and see and hear what he says. So I think that is an interesting sign, and I wonder what exactly is driving him to do this. I mean, he has taken some remarkable steps, buying Bitcoin in this big way, talking to the Kremlin. Maybe, given that he's been always ahead of the curve on many things and is a sort of trendsetter in himself, that's maybe a sign of things to come. I mean, can I just say quickly one very last point about gold? Of course, I remember people, my grandfather, my father, who used to have gold coins in their pockets. They were accustomed to cash in the form of gold sovereigns, for example. They remember, and for them, currency that wasn't based on gold never had complete legitimacy. And some of that, I think, is carried over to my generation.
Sure.
Because we remember all of that. The people who are today at the forefront of creating Bitcoin, I mean, many of them, I mean, the only form of gold they've ever seen is in jewelry. So they have a different mindset about this.
Yes.
And I think that they see the future in radically different ways. And there's something I also wanted to say about risk, which is, of course, risk is the indispensable element in economic activity.
Yes.
If economic activity, any economic activity, you try to take risk out of economic activity stops. I mean, it just can't happen, because that's all economic.
And that's all the policy of the central banks has been since the financial system broke in 2008.
Exactly. Right? If you try to reduce risk to a minimal point, then of course you remove dynamism. You remove
innovation.
Exactly.
You remove an expanding of civilization. Exactly. You remove an expanding division of labor, and what you have is, as the commies always like to say, you have a bunch of useless eaters.
Turgidity. Yes.
And from their perspective, and so what I see with Musk asking the Kremlin for an audience is, I see a Dennis Rodman-like moment where he went to go speak to Kim Jong-un, right, saying U.S. foreign policy refuses to acknowledge you and have a reasonable relationship with you for whatever reason. So I'm going to go one step past that, and I'm going to start that process of legitimizing all this, because Elon Musk is the spirit animal for the millennial generation here in the United States.
Yes,
very good. Very good.
And so if he walks into a conversation with Putin, not Oliver Stone. Now, Oliver Stone is, a great proxy for the boomer generation.
Yes.
But for Elon Musk, the spirit guide of the millennials, you need to talk to Putin. Putin's a very important person. And that changes and undermines all of this anti-Russian, all of this stuff that you were talking about earlier, Rich, with and Alexander, we were talking about Biden's speech at Munich and all of the rest, right? That to say that the Russians are maximal disinformation purveyors, and that all of our corruption is just a phantasm of their projection, which is just nonsense. That changes that dynamic completely. Okay,
I agree.
So, and I think that this is him doing that when he did it. Again, making the announcement about Tesla. He made it on my birthday, by the way. I turned 53 on February 8th, and Elon Musk made the announcement the morning of the markets open on February 8th. I'm like, best 53rd birthday present ever. And then on that Friday, he comes back with, I'd like to speak to the Kremlin, because he understood he saw the response, saw Bitcoin push through to a new all-time high, saw all the other announcements that he knew were coming: Visa, MasterCard, Apple, this one, that one. I've made this point in a couple of different articles recently. When you see that he broke down the wall to say, yeah, all the institutional money is now allowed to come in. And then from there we can see him saying, now we need to change the foreign policy direction, and if the government's not going to do it, then we need to do it ourselves.
Very good. Tom, Alexander, it's been a complete delight. Any last words before we finish up?
Well, what a wide and extraordinary range of things we've talked about. But in fact, this is an inflection point, I think, in the world. Things are going to change. The one thing, by the way, Biden also said in Munich, of course, he doesn't think of it in quite those terms. He probably doesn't know what an inflection point is. But I think it is. I think we are going to, we're going to see changes over the next 20 years, the like of which we have never seen before. And they're not going to be just technological. They're going to be in the whole way society works and interacts with its leaders. And I cannot imagine that Ursula von der Leyen is going to be the shape of things to come. That is just, or Klaus Schwab, or Joe Biden, or God help us, Kamala Harris, or any of these people. I mean, the world is being remade, and it's not going to be remade in the end by them. They have their plans, but what was it Tom said about being a bad copy of Blofeld? That's exactly how they look to me at the moment. More Dr. Evil than Blofeld, if I have to say.
I got a whole can of right here.
Alexander, Tom, listen, thank you both so much. It's been a complete treat. I'll have the links in the description below for their channels. Do go check them out. Really great, smart analysis. And if you have any comments or questions, put them in the description below. Between now and when I see you next, please keep filling your pockets with crypto profits. This is Crypto Rich and Crypto Alexander and Crypto Tom signing out. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.